Well, thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. I'm absolutely delighted to be here, and I've really enjoyed the talk so far. So cloth culture, the concept of cloth culture is based in the ideas that all societies use cloth type materials, but how they do that is specific to that culture. So here in the diagram, we can think about clothing. People find ways to make clothing made out of garments, but at the basis of this are different types of cloth. As we've heard today, the main technologies of cloth in the late Neolithic to early Bronze Age are the technologies of skin products. So thinking of leathers, of furs coming from animals, twined fabric, the technology of using paired wefts to interlace yarns to create a fabric, and of course weaving, the technology that possibly we're more familiar with. Professor Marie Bess has already introduced very nicely the site of Le Petit-Chasseur in Switzerland, and today's interest is in these cloth cultures of the bell beaker phenomenon. And I will consider these from the motifs on the statue menhirs of the type B, the stele from the statues of Sion, Le Petit-Chasseur. So when we're thinking about clothing and representation, there are various ways we can look at these statues to make an analysis. And I want to think of these in 3 levels. So first of all, we have a formal analysis where we're recognizing shape. In this case, maybe recognizing double spirals as a pendant, arms, belt, the copper dagger, which we see engraved on the stone. This is taking a formal analysis, looking at the shape of those motifs to try and recognize what they might look like. But at second level, we then have what we can think of as the conventional subject matter. People are representing other people in these stones, making them look like maybe different genders, different characters of people. And then at a third level, there's a bigger societal meaning. What are people trying to do by engraving these people in stone and these types of cloth? So before I go to Sion, actually, I want us to take us a little bit further east to the Atesino area. And this map showing the distribution of many different statue menhirs across Europe. And I want to do this because I want to think about the cloth culture of a different group of statue menhirs before we think about the bell beaker in particular. Atesino, which is broadly in the Trentino area of Italy, has statue menhirs from a number of different sites, and this is a drawing of some of those. In the motifs, we can see belts, weapons, tools, and in the central one here, can see a garment represented by this curved horizontal bands on the upper body. When we look at the back of some of these statue menhirs, you can see these striking visual checks covering the back of those stones. So what do we think then in terms of materials? Karina's already nicely introduced us to some of these technologies. So what do these motifs maybe represent? We can see striped textures in some of the textiles preserved from the late Neolithic lake dwellings of the circumalpine area. These are float weaves, which means that rather than the weft thread going over and under one warp one by one, sometimes that yarn will be taken over several of those warp threads, creating a different texture in the weave. And we can see the narrow bands of rep-woven textile, again, creating textures in the fabric. And this is a reimagination of one of those costumes, which was part of a museum display, showing this as a textile-based garment. But of course, when we think about the checked the checked garment on the back of some of those statue menhirs, we cannot help but compare these, I don't think, with the coloured furs of the Iceman, who's, of course, dated a number of generations earlier. So this upper body garment with the dark and light coloured strips is very dramatic, and possibly one of the enduring parts of what we might think of the cloth culture of this area in the Eastern Alps. We've considered quite a bit today, actually, twined fabrics, which I think are often forgotten as one of the significant types of material culture in the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age. So here are examples of some of that twined fabric. I think the best known is probably the mat or possible cape found with the Iceman, made out of these paired wefts of lime bast and grass fibres. But this twining is found at all sorts of different scales in the Neolithic lake dwellings and other sites. And the example of the hat from Vangen shows that sometimes there were textures in these twined fabrics, creating these tufted piles. So now I want to take us back further to the west and later in time to the period of the Beaker. As we've already heard, the statue menhirs of this period have these distinctive small geometric motifs, very much like also the statue menhirs at the site of Aosta in northern Italy. And the same features find very close parallels from the early Bronze Age site of Molina de Ledro, again in Trentino in northern Italy to the east. And so in particular, there's a narrow band of textile with a loop at one end, which finds close parallel to the belt, which I can point out here. There's loops at the end of the belt on the statue menhir. From the same site as this preserved concentric lozenge motif, which is seen across many of the statue menhirs of the generations earlier, again created by these float weaves. Another way of maybe creating patterns that we see on the statue menhirs are from techniques such as embroidery or supplementary wefts, with examples coming from the same site of Molina de Ledro and the later site of Erkenhausen in Switzerland. When we think of some of the dot motifs on the statue menhirs, we can consider the numerous beads of the period that are found in both inorganic and organic material. Here, examples shown in seeds sewn onto textiles, or tiny metal studs, an example here from Northern Europe, from Britain. And the motifs on the statue menhirs of the Beaker phase of the site do very much look like these types of textiles and beads. But of course, we mustn't forget that we're looking at stone representations here, and the range of materials could be much wider. Where we have preserved leather, we can also find decorations such as incisions on the leather surface with this dagger sheath from Wiepenkarden, or even leather cutwork cut into the triangles along the edge of this textile band from southern Britain. So we're looking quite far here, but I think we mustn't forget that leather also has this capacity to be decorated in a number of different ways. So these are very much looking at the motifs as a formal analysis, looking at shape and to try and understand techniques and materials. But if we think then, well, what about this more conventional subject matter? These different fabrics that we're looking at in detail today are part of creating statues of people, different kinds of men, different kinds of women, different kinds of people in those societies. And there are many debates as to whether these are mythological figures, if they were real people, deities, and there are all sorts of proposals on these. So we look at these at this level as the motifs being used to create something to say about maybe specific people or ideas of people within that society. If we then think more broadly about the significance of these patterned motifs in broader society, we might ask, well, you know, why are the patterned motifs on the statue menhirs of Sion and Aosta showing these distinctive patterned clothing? Are we looking here at a particular cloth culture of the Beaker phenomenon, as is often assumed, and in this wonderful image by Carol Schauer that the three of us have now shown? Obviously, we can't resist its lovely appeal. So did the people who use the ceramics at certain ceramic material culture, did they have a distinctive cloth culture that made them different from other people of the generations previously in the same area with the different statue menhirs, or different from people maybe in the Atesino area, the statue menhir group I showed you, with quite different types of garments? And so is this then a statement of group identity? Or was this pattern in textile actually quite widespread maybe? The examples of patterned textiles that I've shown you aren't from Beaker contexts. We're looking at preserved textiles from slightly later periods and earlier periods. So did these patterns catch on, or were they just more common than we already think? We also then have the concept of this Beaker material culture being a cross-craft, and we've heard discussions today and throughout the morning of the relationship of the patterns on the beakers, both the impressions of cord and the decorations themselves, as being related to different types of maybe basketry on textiles. And this distinctive geometric horizontal banding certainly seems reminiscent of fabric. And maybe this is part of a cloth culture that was more apparent at the time. So I think many of these questions of the cloth culture of this period are really difficult to answer, and I don't know if we'll completely get to the bottom of those. But I think we mustn't forget that the clothing, the cloth, and the cloth culture that people had at the time would have been a very striking part of their material culture. So even if it's hard as archaeologists to try and gain full answers from this, I think this is something that's well worth paying attention to. Okay, thank you.